On a crucial morning, a millionaire businessman was preparing for the most important meeting of his career when the doorbell rang desperately. An 8-year-old girl appeared at his door, holding his seemingly unconscious and injured 7-year-old son, screaming, "Uncle, your son was run over." Devastated and panicking, he abandoned the billion-dollar meeting to rush to the hospital. There, he discovered something that made his heart freeze. The knot of the silk tie felt like a noose around Arthur Montenegro's neck, tightening not just on his throat, but on his very soul. Every fiber of his being was tuned to the meeting that would take place in less than an hour. A meeting that would define the fate of his empire. The aroma of freshly brewed Colombian coffee, normally a comfort, today smelled of anxiety. From his window, in the penthouse that rose like a fortress of glass and steel over the city, he could see the world of business pulsing below, a world he had conquered, but which now threatened to devour him. This billion-dollar investment wasn't just about money. It was about validating the legacy he had built with sweat and sacrifice over 2 decades. A fortune that seemed rock solid, but was now revealing foundations of sand. His company's stock had plummeted, and this meeting was the only life raft in a sea of debt and market mistrust. His eyes, cold and calculating, landed on the silver picture frame on his mahogany desk. Helena, his late wife, smiled at him, her arms around a little Leo. Her smile was a silent accusation. "Be the father Leo needs, Arthur. Money can't hug him at night," she had whispered on her deathbed, the last words he held as both a treasure and a curse. He had failed. Since she was gone, he had plunged even deeper into work, building walls of wealth around himself. Confusing financial security with fatherly presence, Leo, with his 7 years and sad eyes that were a copy of his mother's, spent more time with the nanny than with him. Guilt was a constant, burning ember in his chest, but the need to maintain his status, his business, his identity as a successful multimillionaire always spoke louder. He took a final sip of coffee, the liquid as bitter as his thoughts. The hour was approaching. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket, the fabric feeling like a suit of armor. He was ready for battle. He had to be, for his legacy, for Helena's memory, for Leo, even if the boy didn't understand. He justified his absence as a way of providing, of ensuring his son would never know the hardships he had known. A convenient lie, he told himself, to be able to sleep at night. That's when the shrill, desperate sound of the doorbell cut through the penthouse's silence. Once, twice, 3 times. With an urgency that deeply irritated him. Who would dare interrupt him this morning? A delivery? An unwelcome neighbor? His first reaction was pure fury. He marched down the marble hallway, his footsteps echoing his impatience, ready to dismiss whoever it was with an icy harshness. He pulled the massive door open with a sharp tug, his mouth already opening to utter a curt command. But the words died in his throat. Before him was not a delivery man or a neighbor. It was a girl, small and thin, with enormous frightened eyes. Her clothes were simple, worn, and she was trembling from head to toe. And in her thin arms, with an effort that seemed superhuman, she held the limp body of his son. Leo was pale, his eyes closed, a dirt-smudged scratch on his cheek, his head lolling in a way that made Arthur's heart stop beating. The business world, the fortune, the billion-dollar investment, it all dissolved into a primal, cold, and absolute terror. The girl looked up at him, tears streaming down her dusty face, and her voice came out in a choked cry that shattered Arthur's universe into a million pieces. "Mister, your son, he was hit by a car." For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Arthur's brain refused to process the scene. The sound of the world faded, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. His son, his Leo, limp and pale in a stranger's arms. The phrase, "hit by a car," echoed in his mind, a sledgehammer breaking down the walls of control he had built around himself. his entire empire, his meticulously accumulated fortune, his plans for expansion and market domination. It all turned to insignificant dust before the image of a small life he had neglected. Instinct, primitive and overwhelming, took the place of the calculating businessman. He didn't think, he just acted. With a swift movement, he took Leo from the girl's arms, his son's weight terrifyingly light, his body cold against the expensive fabric of his suit. The girl's eyes followed him, filled with a panic that mirrored his own. "The car, it came so fast," she stammered, her voice thin and trembling. Arthur didn't answer. His mind was a storm of guilt and fear. The meeting, the investors, the millions of dollars at stake, none of it mattered. He spun on his heel, running back inside the penthouse, shouting for the girl to follow him. His cell phone, forgotten on the coffee table, began to vibrate insistently. It was his assistant, no doubt, informing him that the investors had arrived. That ring, which would normally make his heart race with anticipation, was now an irritating noise, a distraction from the only deal that mattered, his son's life. He strode past the vibrating device as if it were a foreign object, grabbing only his car keys. He gently placed Leo in the back seat, the boy's head resting on his cashmere coat. The girl got into the passenger seat without being told, huddled and silent. The drive to the hospital was a blur of angry horns and ignored traffic lights. Arthur drove with a reckless precision, his hands, which hours before would have signed multi-million-dollar contracts, now shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. With every second, the image of Helena in her hospital bed haunted him. "Take care of our boy," she had asked. And he, in his arrogance, had believed that building an unshakable fortune was the best form of care. What a fool he had been. What kind of legacy was worth it if it cost him his son's smile? He glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, his chest tightening with every shallow breath Leo seemed to take. Who was this girl? How had this happened? The questions swirled, but there was no room for answers, only for the raw fear that consumed him. Arriving at the emergency room, he jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped. He handed Leo into the arms of a nurse who rushed to meet him, explaining the situation in broken, urgent sentences. "Hit and run. My son, 7 years old. Please." They took Leo away on a gurney, disappearing through a pair of automatic doors that closed with a dull thud, leaving Arthur behind. Alone in the sterile, noisy corridor, the girl was beside him, a small ghost amidst the chaos. He sank into a plastic chair, the adrenaline abandoning him, leaving behind a cold emptiness. Time dragged on. Every minute was torture. He didn't know what to do with his hands, with his thoughts, with the guilt that was suffocating him. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of waiting, the same doors opened. A doctor in a white coat with a serious expression walked towards him. Arthur shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs, the air trapped in his lungs, waiting for the verdict that could destroy what was left of his world. The doctor stopped a few feet from Arthur, the clipboard in his hands serving as a fragile barrier against the father's torrent of panic. The professional's face was not one of grief, but of slight confusion, which unsettled Arthur even more. He braced himself for the impact, for the clinical words that would describe the extent of the injuries, for the news that would break him forever. But what came was something entirely unexpected. "Mr. Montenegro," the doctor began, his voice calm. "There's been a misunderstanding, I think. Your son is perfectly fine." Arthur blinked, the sentence hanging in the air without making sense. "Fine? What do you mean? Fine? He was hit by a car." His voice came out louder and harsher than he intended. The doctor frowned. "We ran a full examination. He has some scrapes on his knee and cheek, consistent with a fall on a playground or something similar, but there is absolutely no sign of impact trauma, no fractures, no internal injuries. He's a little scared, but otherwise, he's in perfect health." The information hit Arthur like a wave, first cold with disbelief, then warm with a relief so overwhelming his legs felt weak. Fine. Leo was fine. The word reverberated in his soul, healing the wound torn open by panic. He ran a hand over his face, a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh, escaping his lips. All the fear, the guilt, the image of Helena, it all dissipated in that single, glorious truth. Can I see him?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. The doctor smiled sympathetically and led him down a hallway to a small observation room. And there he was, Leo, sitting on the edge of a gurney too high for his legs, swinging his feet and sucking on a red lollipop a nurse must have given him. The scratch on his cheek was superficial, almost a childish detail. His eyes widened when he saw his father. "Dad," he said, his voice slightly muffled by the candy. Arthur rushed to him, wrapping him in a desperate hug. Inhaling the scent of his hair, feeling the warmth of his small, living body, it was real. He was okay. For several minutes, Arthur just held him, his heart gradually returning to its normal rhythm. But as the tide of relief receded, the shore of reality began to appear, and with it, the wreckage of his morning, the meeting, the investors, the future of his legacy. He had abandoned the most crucial transaction of his career, a deal involving immense capital, because of what? A scraped knee. The confusion began to solidify into a cold, hard suspicion. The image of the frightened girl returned to his mind, the desperation in her eyes, the tremble in her voice. Had it all been an act? A performance? Why? He pulled back slightly from Leo, holding his shoulders. "Son, what happened? That girl, what did she tell you?" Leo looked down at the lollipop in his hand. "She said it was a game, that I had to pretend to be asleep to scare you." The simplicity of the confession was like a punch to Arthur's gut. A scare. He had been manipulated, made a fool of by a street kid. Fury began to bubble beneath the surface, a cold rage directed at that unknown girl. Who was she? What did she want? Money? It didn't make sense. He stood up, his expression hardening. He needed answers. "Stay here with the nurse, champ. Dad will be right back." He turned and marched out of the room, his steps firm and determined, back to the waiting area. He would find her. He would demand an explanation for this cruel game. But when he reached the spot where he had left her, the plastic chair was empty. He swept the room with his gaze, but there was no sign of her. The mysterious girl who had turned his world upside down had simply vanished. A vacuum opened where the girl had been. Her disappearance was more unsettling than her appearance. Arthur stood in the middle of the hospital corridor, a powerful man accustomed to having all the answers, now completely adrift. The anger he felt at being deceived began to mix with a strange and unsettling curiosity. Why would a child orchestrate something so elaborate? What could she possibly gain? He returned to Leo's room, his mind racing. The image of his son, safe and unharmed, was the only anchor in a sea of confusion. He needed to get him out of there, back to the safety of his home, and try to understand what had happened to his morning, his life, and most importantly, his financial empire. The word meeting flashed in his mind again like a fire alarm. The investment, the future of everything he had built. In the car, on the way home, the silence was heavy. Leo, sensing the shift in his father's mood, remained quiet in the back seat. Looking out the window, Arthur picked up his cell phone, his hands still slightly trembling. He dialed his assistant's number, prepared for the avalanche of bad news. "Mark, it's me. What did I miss? How big is the disaster?" On the other end of the line, Mark's voice was tense, almost a whisper. "Arthur, thank God you're okay. Where are you?" The question caught Arthur by surprise. "I'm on my way back from the hospital with Leo." Long story. What happened with the investors? They walked out furious, I imagine. There was a pause. "Arthur, it's complicated. Just stay away from the office for now. Stay home with your son. "I'll call you later with the details." And he hung up. Mark's enigmatic answer only heightened Arthur's anxiety. Stay away. Why? That wasn't the protocol for a failed deal. This was something else. A feeling that he was missing a fundamental piece of the puzzle washed over him. He dropped Leo at home with the nanny, making sure the boy was truly all right, and then, against his assistant's advice, got back in his car. He couldn't just wait at home. He needed to see the damage with his own eyes, maybe try for an emergency meeting, offer apologies, salvage what was possible from the deal that would define the future of his capital. He sped toward the financial district, his heart pounding with the anticipation of the confrontation. But as he approached the mirrored skyscraper where the meeting was supposed to have taken place, he saw it, flashing red and blue lights, reflecting chaotically off the building's glass facade. Several police cars blocked the entrance, and the area was cordoned off with yellow tape. Arthur slammed on the brakes, the car's tires screeching. What was this? A fire? A false alarm? He got out of the car, the knot in his throat tightening again. But this time it wasn't about business. Something was terribly wrong. That's when he saw them. Several men in expensive suits, some of whom he would recognize in any boardroom in the world, being escorted out of the building with their hands behind their backs in handcuffs. Among them, the pale, shocked faces of executives from rival companies. His partner, Ricardo, was leaning against a squad car, talking to a detective, his face as white as a sheet. The scene was surreal, a nightmare from the evening news invading his world of high finance. An officer approached him, holding up a hand. "Sir, please step back. This is an active investigation scene." Arthur was paralyzed, his mind trying to connect the dots. The girl, the fake accident, the meeting he missed, the men being arrested. It wasn't a game. It wasn't about money. That farce, that desperate lie told by a trembling child. Somehow, it had kept him from being here. It had saved him. But from what? The revelation fell on Arthur like an avalanche. Every detail of that chaotic morning began to fit into a terrifying mosaic. The desperation in the girl's eyes hadn't been faked. It was real, but for a reason he could never have imagined. She wasn't tricking him for fun or to extort him. She was protecting him. The urgency in her voice, the theater of the accident. It had all been a desperate act to keep him away from that building, away from that meeting, away from the trap. The understanding hit him with physical force, leaving him breathless. He hadn't lost a deal. He had escaped a disaster of unknown proportions. He backed away toward his car, his brain spinning furiously, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The handcuffed men, the police, the investigation. A kidnapping. The word surfaced in his mind, cold and sharp. They were planning to kidnap him, or worse, he had to find that girl. The need was overwhelming, no longer driven by anger, but by a profound gratitude and an urgent need to understand. How did she know? Who was she? He started the car and drove away from the crime scene, his mind focused on a single objective. He had nothing to go on but the vague memory of her face and her simple clothes. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He drove aimlessly for a while, the city seeming alien and threatening. Then a detail came back to him. The scratch on Leo's face. It looked like it was smudged with reddish dirt, like from a playground. There was a public park a few blocks from his penthouse E, a place he rarely visited, but where the nanny often took Leo to play. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead he had. He parked near the park and started walking, his heart beating fast. The place was nearly empty in the middle of a weekday afternoon. He watched the few children running and playing, but none of them was the girl he was looking for. Frustration began to build. What if he never saw her again? How could he thank the person who, for some inexplicable reason, had saved his life? He was about to give up when he saw her. She was sitting alone on a swing, pushing herself slowly with the tips of her toes, her gaze lost on the horizon. The same faded dress, the same dark hair, Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He approached slowly, afraid of scaring her. She saw him coming and stopped the swing, her body tensing, her large eyes fixed on him, not with fear, but with a seriousness that didn't belong to a child. "Your son, is he really okay?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Arthur nodded, stopping at a respectful distance. "He's fine, thanks to you." He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't know how you knew or why you did what you did, but you saved me. That meeting, it was a trap. How did you know?" The girl looked down at her own feet, her worn shoe drawing circles in the dust. "I heard some men talking near my home. They were talking about the millionaire in the big penthouse and the meeting today. They said they were going to get you." Her explanation was so simple, so direct, it seemed almost impossible. "And why help me?" "You don't know me." She finally lifted her face, and in her eyes was a depth that shook him. "My mom taught me to always help good people, and you're a good person." Arthur frowned, confused. "Your mom? Does she know me?" The girl nodded. "A long time ago, before I was born. My name is Lyra, and my mom is Clara." The name hit him like a lightning bolt from a cloudless sky. Clara, a young woman whose nursing school tuition he had funded years ago, one of the few anonymous philanthropic acts he had ever made, driven by a rare moment of altruism after Helena's death. A small seed of kindness planted in the past, now blooming to save his life. The world suddenly seemed smaller and infinitely more connected. Lyra's revelation echoed in the park's silence, rewriting Arthur's past in a new light. Clara, he remembered her vaguely, a determined young woman with eyes full of hope whom he'd met at a charity gala. He had funded her studies, a gesture that at the time seemed small, a low-risk investment in human capital. He never imagined the dividends on that act would be paid out so dramatically and personally. That one action, nearly forgotten amidst stock trades and corporate acquisitions, had created an invisible bond, a debt of gratitude that was now being repaid with his own life. He looked at little Lyra, the personification of that gesture, and felt a wave of humility he hadn't experienced in a long time. He, the multimillionaire who believed he controlled the world with his money, had been saved by the daughter of someone he barely remembered helping. "I need to speak with your mother," Arthur said, his voice thick with an urgency Lyra seemed to understand. "I need to thank her, and I need to make sure you're both safe." The mention of safety made the girl's shoulders slump. The courage she had displayed earlier seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a palpable, childlike fear. "They were bad men, mister. If they find out it was me..." She didn't have to finish the sentence. The implication was clear and terrifying. These criminals weren't amateurs. They were part of a scheme sophisticated enough to plan a high-profile kidnapping. Retaliation would be swift and merciless. The weight of responsibility fell upon Arthur. He was no longer just a beneficiary of Lyra's courage. He was her protector. Lyra led him home, to a small apartment in a modest building several blocks away, a world apart from his penthouse. The smell of home cooking and disinfectant hung in the air. Clara, a woman with gentle features and work-calloused hands, opened the door. The recognition in her eyes was immediate, followed by a look of panic when she saw Arthur. Lyra ran into her arms. "Mom, I told him." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, her hand squeezing her daughter's shoulder. When she opened them again, there was a mixture of fear and resignation. "Please, come in, Mr. Montenegro." Inside the simple but immaculately clean apartment, Clara told her side of the story. She worked as a nurse at a community health clinic and, by chance, had overheard a conversation between two patients with minor injuries. They were speaking quietly, but she caught fragments. The billionaire, the morning meeting, easy as taking candy from a baby. Instinct told her something was wrong. She connected the dots, remembering news reports about the financial troubles of Arthur's company and the importance of that meeting. Fear paralyzed her, but the thought that the man who had changed her life was in danger spurred her to act. It was Lyra, with the fearless logic of a child, who came up with the plan. "And if we call the police, they might not believe us, Mom. But if his son gets hurt, he won't go to the meeting." Arthur listened, stunned at the courage and ingenuity born of desperation. While he was worrying about cash flow and asset returns, a mother and daughter, with nothing but gratitude and bravery, were architecting his salvation. The feeling of debt was immense. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "But right now, my priority is to protect you. I'll hire the best security, get you out of here, take you somewhere safe." Clara shook her head, the fear in her eyes now stronger. "We can't, sir. We have nowhere to go. This is our life. If we run, they'll know we were involved." She was right. Any sudden, obvious move by Arthur to protect them would be a flare signal to the criminals still at large. He was trapped. He had to protect them, but any conventional method, any display of his wealth and power, would put an even bigger target on this family's back. The week that followed was a silent torture. Arthur lived in a state of constant alert, a schizophrenic duality between the facade of normalcy he had to maintain and the simmering panic beneath the surface. The news of the foiled kidnapping spread like wildfire, but details were scarce, and the police officially remained tight-lipped about Arthur's involvement. To the world, he was just a lucky businessman who, by a twist of fate, had missed a meeting that turned into a crime scene. But Arthur knew the truth. Every car that slowed down on his street, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, felt like a potential threat. He wanted to wrap Clara and Lyra in a bubble of security, to use his fortune to hide them on some distant paradise. But Clara's argument echoed in his mind. A sudden disappearance would be a confession that they knew something. His relationship with Leo also became a minefield. The boy, confused by the sequence of events, the fake accident, his father's panic, the sudden attention, was more withdrawn than ever. Arthur tried to connect, taking him on outings, buying him expensive gifts, but he felt a chasm between them. Leo felt that he had been used. Even without understanding the complexity of the situation, he sensed the lie and fear in the adults' eyes, and it frightened him. "Why did that girl lie, Dad?" he would ask, and Arthur didn't have an answer he could give a 7-year-old. How do you explain that a lie saved your life, but now put you all in even greater danger? The attempt to protect Lyra was driving him further away from his own son. The pressure mounted daily. The arrested criminals weren't talking, and their accomplices, including the mastermind, remained free. Arthur felt hunted. He discreetly hired a private security team to watch Clara and Lyra's neighborhood from a distance, a measure that minimally calmed him but also felt dangerously inadequate. The impotence was a poison. He, who had built an empire on the premise of control and power, was now a mere spectator in a game whose rules he didn't know. Money, his tool for solving every problem, was useless. Worse, it was a beacon that attracted predators. On a rainy afternoon, nearly a week after the incident, Arthur received a call from a blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was distorted, electronically altered, cold and emotionless. "Montenegro? We hear you were very lucky. Too lucky." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice laughed, a metallic, humorless sound. "Someone who lost a major investment because of you. We're curious. What kept you from the meeting? A premonition? Or maybe a little angel whispered in your ear?" Terror seized Arthur. They knew, or at least they suspected. "I don't know what you're talking about." The voice continued, ignoring him. "We're going to find out. And when we find out who your little angel is, we're going to make sure they can never fly again." The call ended abruptly, leaving a dead silence on the line. The message was clear. The hunt had begun. They were no longer just looking for him. They were looking for Lyra. At that exact moment, as panic threatened to swallow him whole, his personal cell phone rang again. It was the lead detective on the case, a man named Miller, with whom he had been cooperating. "Mr. Montenegro, I need you to come down to the precinct. We have a development, a very bad one." Arthur grabbed his car keys, his heart racing out of control. What else could possibly go wrong? When he arrived at the station, Miller led him into a private room. The detective's expression was grim. "We've been reviewing the security footage from your building on the day of the incident. We wanted to see if anyone was watching you." He turned a laptop screen toward Arthur. "We thought the danger was coming from the outside. We were wrong." On the screen, a frozen image showed a man in the lobby of Arthur's building, an hour before the meeting. The man was talking casually with the security guard, smiling. He wore an impeccable suit and a watch Arthur would recognize anywhere. It was Ricardo, his partner, his friend of over 20 years. The man he would have left in charge of the company if anything happened to him. He was the leader of it all. The image on the laptop screen was a blow to the soul. Ricardo, Leo's godfather, the man with whom he had shared dreams, failures, and the building of an empire. The betrayal was so profound, so visceral, that for a moment Arthur felt the floor disappear from under his feet. Every shared memory, every handshake, every piece of business advice now revealed itself as part of a long and meticulous deception. Ricardo wasn't his partner. He was a predator who had been patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. Detective Miller watched Arthur, the professional compassion in his eyes unable to mask the gravity of the situation. "Your partner was the mastermind behind it all, Mr. Montenegro. He sold information about your routine, your security, and most importantly, about the meeting. The plan was simple: kidnap you, force you to transfer control of your stock, and then make you disappear. With you out of the picture, he would assume total control of the company's assets." Miller's words were like hammer blows, each one driving the reality of the betrayal deeper. Arthur sat down, the strength draining from his legs. The coldness of the plan was terrifying. Ricardo hadn't just wanted his wealth, he wanted to erase his existence. But why? The question escaped Arthur's lips, a whisper of pure disbelief. The detective sighed. Greed, envy. From what we've gathered, he had massive gambling debts, bad crypto investments that went south. He saw your fortune as the solution to all his problems. The irony was cruel. While Arthur had worked obsessively to grow his assets, his closest friend was plotting to steal everything, including his life. The pathological mistrust that had always followed him, which Helena had gently criticized, suddenly seemed like a virtue. A shame it hadn't been strong enough to see the enemy standing right beside him. The revelation about Ricardo changed everything. The danger was no longer an anonymous, external threat. It had a face, a name, and it knew Arthur's every vulnerability. Ricardo knew about Leo, about his habits, about the penthouse, and if he was the mastermind, the anonymous call made perfect sense. He was hunting for the source of the leak, the person who had foiled his perfect plan. He was hunting for Lyra. A new kind of fear, sharper and more protective, took hold of Arthur. He had to act, and fast. "Can't you arrest him?" he asked Miller, his voice regaining some of its strength. "Not yet," the detective replied, his frustration evident. "The image in the lobby proves he was there, but it doesn't prove he was leading the scheme. The men we arrested haven't given him up. We need something more concrete, something that ties him directly to the crime." Arthur returned home with a crushing weight on his shoulders. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a glass cage, vulnerable and exposed. He looked at Leo, playing on the living room rug with his action figures, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. The sight of his son awakened a cold fury in him. Ricardo wasn't just threatening his business, he was threatening his family. The subplot of his relationship with Leo took on a new shape. The boy, who had felt used and betrayed by Lyra's deception, was now at the center of a very real danger. Arthur knelt beside his son. "Leo, we need to talk. It's about Lyra." For the first time, he decided to tell a version of the truth, tailored for a child's understanding. "Son, Lyra didn't lie to scare you. She lied to protect me. There were bad men who wanted to hurt me, and her game stopped me from meeting them. She was very brave." Leo looked up from his toys, confusion giving way to a spark of understanding. Like in superhero movies. Arthur managed a sad smile. "Exactly, like in the movies. And now, we have to be her heroes. We need to protect her because the bad men are looking for her." The seed of responsibility was planted. Leo's resentment began to transform into a sense of purpose. He was no longer the victim of a prank, but a participant in a secret mission to protect a heroine. The change in his posture was subtle, but to Arthur, it was monumental. That night, for the first time in a long time, Leo asked to sleep in his father's bed. And as Arthur held him in the dark, the fear still present, he felt something new forming, an alliance. Father and son, united against a common enemy, ready to fight for the girl who had saved them. The newfound alliance between Arthur and Leo transformed the atmosphere of the penthouse. Fear still hung in the air, thick and inescapable, but it was now counterbalanced by a sense of shared mission. Leo, with the seriousness of a miniature general, took on his role as protector. He drew maps of the house with secret escape routes and insisted on checking the door locks before bed. For Arthur, these childish games were both a balm and a torture. They eased the tension, but also served as a constant reminder of the innocence that was at stake. His son's transformation was remarkable. The resentful child was giving way to a boy who understood, on his own level, the weight of courage and loyalty. He began to speak of Lyra, not as the girl who tricked him, but as our secret friend who needed help. Meanwhile, Arthur moved on a dangerous chessboard. The revelation about Ricardo forced him to re-evaluate every interaction, every email, every conversation from the past few years. He felt as if he were walking through his own home, but with all the walls removed, exposing him to an enemy who knew the floor plan of his soul. He continued to go to the office, maintaining the charade of normalcy. Facing Ricardo every day was a test of self-control. His partner's easy smile, his concerned questions about the incident, all of it was coated in a veneer of poison. Arthur responded with calculated coldness, using his work obsession as an excuse for his distance. Every meeting became a performance, every handshake a silent battle. Protecting Clara and Lyra became his obsession. He knew that distant surveillance wasn't enough. He needed a more robust, yet discreet plan. The difficulty was immense: how to move them without raising suspicion, how to communicate without leaving a digital trail that Ricardo's team, likely tech-savvy, could intercept. He started using burner phones and meeting with Detective Miller in crowded public places, like food courts in malls, to evade any kind of surveillance. With each meeting, Miller's frustration was more palpable. "He's careful, Arthur. He doesn't make mistakes, and we have a bigger problem." The detective hesitated, his gaze heavy. "We have reason to believe there's a leak within our own department. Someone is feeding information to Ricardo's side." The news was devastating. The police, the very institution that should have been his greatest ally, was also compromised. Arthur was increasingly alone, cornered. Ricardo's network was wider and more infiltrated than he had imagined, reaching into the corridors of power and law. Any move he made through official channels could be telegraphed directly to the enemy. The feeling of helplessness returned with full force. His vast financial resources, his network of contacts, his influential power, all proved useless against a conspiracy that was corroding the very foundations of societal trust. He couldn't buy safety. He couldn't hire justice. Desperate, Arthur made a risky decision. He needed eyes and ears in a place Ricardo would never expect. He remembered a former head of security who had retired, a man named Sullivan, an old-school type who trusted instincts and human surveillance over technology. Sullivan was loyal, discreet, and owed Arthur a favor. He met him in a simple diner, far from the financial district. He explained the situation, Ricardo's betrayal, the corruption in the police force, the threat to Lyra. Sullivan listened in silence, his weathered face impassive. When Arthur finished, the old security man took a sip of his coffee. "That Ricardo kid was always too ambitious," he said, his voice gravelly. "To catch a snake, you can't be afraid to step into the nest. I'll take a look. But you should know, Arthur, when you stir up a nest like this, other snakes tend to show up." The warning was ominous, but Arthur had no choice. He needed someone who could operate in the shadows, someone he could trust. He had no idea that by stirring that nest, he was about to wake a predator that would make Ricardo seem like a secondary problem. The days blurred into a haze of surveillance and fear. Sullivan, the old security man, was an efficient shadow, his reports delivered via discreet notes or calls from payphones, an archaic method that now seemed the only secure form of communication. The news was not good. "They're sniffing around," read Sullivan's rough handwriting on a paper napkin left under Arthur's tire, "asking questions in the woman's neighborhood, about deliveries, visitors, anything out of the ordinary in the last week." Ricardo was being methodical. He wasn't using brute force, but intelligence, subtle pressure, like a snake circling its prey before striking. Every report from Sullivan was a reminder that time was running out. Arthur felt the net closing. Not around him, but around the small family he had sworn to protect. His vast fortune, his assets spread across the globe. It all seemed like a bad joke in the face of his inability to guarantee the safety of a mother and her daughter. The tension at home was almost unbearable. Leo, now fully invested in his role as a co-conspirator, tried to help in the only way he knew how. One morning, he presented Arthur with a crayon drawing. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, a tall man, a small boy, and a girl with a big smile. "It's for Lyra," he said, his eyes shining with pride. "So she knows we haven't forgotten her." Arthur's heart broke. That pure gesture, a symbol of connection and gratitude, was a risk they couldn't afford to take. How do you explain to a child that a simple drawing could be a sentence? "Son, it's beautiful," he said, his voice thick. "But, for now, we have to keep it in a super-secret place. It's part of our mission. Heroes have to keep their plans secret, remember?" Leo looked disappointed but nodded, his loyalty overcoming his frustration. That drawing became another burden for Arthur, a tangible reminder of the innocence he was fighting so desperately to preserve. That afternoon, the blow came. The burner phone rang, and it was Clara, her voice a trembling thread of panic. "Arthur, just someone was here." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened? Are you okay?" "Yes, we're fine. We went to the grocery store, and when we came back, the door was unlocked. I always lock it. I swear I did." Her voice broke. "They didn't take anything. The cash I kept in the drawer, my old laptop. Everything's here. But they touched Lyra's things." Arthur held his breath. "What did they do?" There was a sob on the other end of the line. "Her doll, the rag doll my mother made for her. It was on her bed, under the pillow. Now, it's sitting on the only chair in the living room, facing the door, like it was waiting for us." The image was chilling in its simplicity. It wasn't an act of theft. It was a message, a violation, a clear warning that they could come and go as they pleased, that they could touch what was most precious to them. It was psychological terror in its cruelest form. "Clara, listen to me. Calm down. Just pretend nothing happened. Pretend you forgot to lock the door. Don't call the police. They're watching," Arthur said, the words coming out automatically while his own mind reeled from the impact. He was trying to project a calm he didn't feel, his heart hammering against his ribs. While he was trying to calm Clara, his other phone, his personal one, began to ring. It was Sullivan. Arthur motioned for Clara to wait, his chest tight with a terrible premonition. He answered Sullivan's call. Arthur. The old security man's voice was grim, without preamble. The message wasn't just the doll. They left something else. On the door jamb, outside. Something only you would understand. Arthur closed his eyes, dreading the answer. What was it, Sullivan? A single chess piece, a white pawn. The image of the white pawn, solitary and insignificant, exploded in Arthur's mind with the force of a grenade. It wasn't a random symbol. It was a personal message, a fragment of a past he shared only with Ricardo. For years, in the early days of the company, they would relax by playing chess. Arthur, the aggressive player, always sacrificing minor pieces in pursuit of victory. Ricardo, the patient strategist, would always remind him, never underestimate the pawn, Arthur. It's the soul of the game. It looks weak, but it can become the most powerful piece. Leaving a pawn on Clara's door was Ricardo's cruelest way of saying, I know everything. I know you're using someone insignificant to protect you, and I'm going to crush her. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war, and Lyra was the battlefield. The game had changed. It was no longer about hiding. It was about survival. The coldness of Ricardo's message ignited a fury in Arthur that he hadn't felt in years. Passivity, the strategy of waiting and reacting, was over. He had to take the initiative, to force Ricardo's hand, to create a trap so perfect that not even the corrupt police system could ignore it. He spent the night awake, his brain working at a frantic pace, analyzing every angle. His fortune, once a burden that made him a target, now had to become his greatest weapon. He couldn't use legal means, so he would use the enemy's methods: deception, manipulation, and a high-stakes gamble. The plan that began to form was audacious and dangerous, risking not only his legacy but the only thing of value he had left, his son. The next morning, he met with Sullivan, not in a bustling cafe but in an abandoned warehouse in the Port District. The grim atmosphere matched Arthur's mood. He laid out his plan. Ricardo is expecting me to protect the girl, to hide her. That's what he wants, for me to make a mistake. But we're going to give him something different. We're going to give him bait he can't resist. Sullivan listened, his face impassive, as Arthur detailed his strategy. I'm going to spread a rumor that the girl didn't just overhear the conversation, but that she has proof, that she recorded everything on the toy phone she always carries. It was a complete lie, a risky fabrication. Ricardo will be desperate to get his hands on that proof. He can't risk it falling into the hands of the honest cops. Sullivan pondered for a moment, the silence in the warehouse broken only by the distant sound of a ship's horn. It's good bait, Arthur, but it's dangerous. You'll be putting the girl directly in his sights. He won't just watch anymore. He'll act, Arthur nodded, his jaw tight. I know. And that's exactly what I want. I want him to come out of the shadows. And when he comes for her, we'll be waiting. The plan had a second layer, the part that made Arthur's stomach turn. For the trap to work, Lyra has to actually disappear, and the disappearance has to look real. It has to create panic. Ricardo has to believe he has a short window before the proof surfaces. Sullivan understood the implication. You're going to kidnap her yourself? Arthur shook his head. Not me. Someone Clara trusts implicitly. You, Sullivan, you'll take her somewhere safe, a place even I won't know. But the world, the police, and especially Ricardo, will believe Lyra was kidnapped by the criminals. The weight of the decision was crushing. He would be inflicting on Clara the same terror he had felt on that fateful morning, even if it was for a greater good. And he would be putting Lyra in a situation of isolation and fear. It was a terrible sacrifice. But when Arthur returned home that afternoon, ready to initiate the most dangerous operation of his life, he found a manila envelope on his office desk. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. There were no words, only a photo. It was a picture of Leo, taken with a long-range lens, playing in the penthouse garden, alone, vulnerable. And in the bottom corner of the photo, written in red pen, was the same message Ricardo used to write at the end of their chess games, when he knew victory was inevitable. Checkmate. The photograph was like a punch to the solar plexus, stealing all the air from his lungs. Checkmate. The arrogance in those two words was absolute. Ricardo was no longer playing chess. He had knocked over the board. The threat was no longer Lyra, the pawn. It was the king. It was Leo. Arthur's fury gave way to a primal, cold, and paralyzing fear. He had underestimated Ricardo's cruelty, his willingness to cross the final line. Every plan, every strategy he had devised, crumbled before the image of his son in a predator's sights. The bait, the trap, it all seemed like amateurish foolishness now. How could he risk Lyra's safety when his own son's was so explicitly threatened? He was trapped. Forced into an impossible choice: save the girl who saved him, or protect his son. He ran through the house, his heart hammering uncontrollably, until he found Leo in his room, building a complex castle out of blocks, completely unaware of the earthquake shaking his father's life. Arthur hugged him with a force that startled the boy. "Dad, you're squeezing me." Arthur released him, trying to mask the panic on his face. "Sorry, champ. I just love you so much." In that moment, he made a decision. Nothing else mattered. No business, no revenge, no justice, only Leo's safety. He reached for the phone to call Sullivan and call everything off. To surrender, to give Ricardo whatever he wanted in exchange for his family's peace. But as he dialed, his gaze fell on Leo's desk. There, tucked under a book, was the drawing the boy had made for Lyra, the 3 stick figures, holding hands, a symbol of their small alliance, of their promise to protect their secret friend. To surrender would mean abandoning Lyra and Clara to their fate. It would mean teaching Leo that, in the face of evil, the only response was cowardice. It would mean betraying the courage of an 8-year-old girl and the memory of his wife, who had always believed in kindness and strength of character. The guilt and conflict tore him apart. He looked at his son, who had returned to his playing, and the image from the photograph superimposed itself on the scene, creating a distorted and terrifying vision. Time was running out. Ricardo was waiting for a response, a capitulation, and inaction was, in itself, a response that could have fatal consequences. It was then that a desperate idea, born from the purest agony, began to form. What if he didn't have to choose? What if he could use Ricardo's own threat against him? The original plan was to use Lyra as bait, but Ricardo had changed the target. He had placed Leo at the center of the board. What if Arthur accepted the game, but with his own rules? The irony of the situation was overwhelming. To save everyone, he would have to do exactly what Lyra had done at the beginning: stage an emergency involving his own son. The plan was monstrous in its risk. It involved putting Leo in apparent danger, creating a scenario of kidnapping so convincing that it would force the hand not only of Ricardo, but also of the honest faction of the police, giving them the justification to act without the constraints of bureaucracy and corruption. He called Sullivan. "Change of plans," he said, his voice firm, hiding the tremor in his hands. "The bait won't be the girl anymore. It'll be my son." On the other end of the line, there was a shocked silence. "Arthur, have you lost your mind? It's too risky." "It's the only move we have left," Arthur retorted. "Ricardo is expecting me to protect Leo. He won't expect me to use him. He underestimates me. He thinks I'm just a businessman. But he's forgotten that before anything else, I'm a father. And a father will do the unthinkable to protect his family." He hung up and turned to face the most difficult task of his life, explaining to a 7-year-old boy that he needed to become the hero in a very real and dangerous story. A story where the monster didn't live under the bed, but wore an expensive suit and called him Godson. The emotional climax of his journey was about to begin, and he had less than 48 hours to orchestrate the bluff that could either save everyone or destroy everything he loved. The next 48 hours were the longest and most torturous of Arthur's life. Every second was weighted with an unthinkable gamble. The conversation with Leo was delicate, a mix of fairy tale and spy manual. Arthur explained that they had to play a giant trick on the bad man to get him caught. Leo, with the unshakable trust a child places in his father, agreed, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and a hint of fear. The mission was simple. He would go on an outing with Sullivan, whom he knew as a friend of his father's, and stay hidden for a while, with no calls allowed. The heroism of the task outweighed the boy's fear, turning him into a secret agent on his own adventure. For Arthur, every one of Leo's brave smiles was a knife in his heart. The plan was executed with military precision. Sullivan kidnapped Leo in broad daylight from a busy park, a swift, confusing action that was witnessed by one of the few police officers Detective Miller trusted. The news exploded. The son of multimillionaire Arthur Montenegro had been abducted. The panic was immediate and real. Arthur played the role of a lifetime, that of the devastated father, desperate in front of the TV cameras camped outside his penthouse, but behind the scenes. He was in direct contact with Miller, feeding him information that subtly pointed toward Ricardo. Ricardo's reaction was exactly as Arthur had predicted. The initial shock, the offers of help, the false solidarity. But beneath the mask, Sullivan, who was now watching Ricardo closely, reported frantic activity. Ricardo was making calls, trying to figure out who was behind the kidnapping, terrified that a rival group had entered the game. He couldn't understand how he had lost control. The bait had worked. Ricardo was destabilized. The final piece of the puzzle, however, came from an unexpected place. Clara, upon hearing of Leo's kidnapping, felt a wave of guilt and courage. She called Arthur, her voice firm. "I can't stay silent anymore. Lyra didn't record anything, but my late mother, who worked as a cleaner in your company's building for years, did." Arthur was speechless. "What?" Clara explained. Her mother, an observant and mistrustful woman, had overheard Ricardo's conversations for years. She sensed he was untrustworthy and, using a small recorder she kept in her apron pocket, began to register snippets of suspicious conversations, especially those he had in his office late at night. She never knew exactly what she had, but she kept the microcassettes in an old sewing box, telling Clara they might be useful one day. After her mother's death, Clara had kept the box for sentimental value, never knowing its explosive contents. It was the most unlikely and valuable inheritance in the world. Arthur's late wife, Helena, who always visited the building and chatted with the staff, had been friends with Clara's mother. It was Helena who, recognizing Clara's intelligence, had encouraged Arthur to fund her studies. The circle was closing in a poetic and devastating way. Ricardo's conspiracy was older than Arthur had imagined. The tapes didn't just contain the kidnapping plot, they contained years of fraud, stock manipulation, and betrayals. With the tapes in hand, delivered by a courageous Clara to Miller, the police finally had the irrefutable proof they needed. The web of corruption was exposed. Ricardo's arrest in his panoramic boardroom was not an act of violence, but of silent humiliation. He saw Arthur standing in the hallway, and in his eyes there was no anger, only the empty understanding of defeat. The criminal network, including the corrupt cops, was dismantled. Leo was rescued and returned to his father's arms, the small hero of a war he barely understood. Arthur's first victory was everyone's safety, but it came at a cost. The tapes, while exposing Ricardo, also revealed irregularities in Arthur's own business dealings, aggressive practices that, while not illegal, bordered on immoral. To clear the company's name and ensure justice was served, he had to relinquish control. Selling his stock and dismantling the empire he had spent a lifetime building, he lost his fortune, but he saved his soul. The dust settled slowly, revealing an entirely new landscape in Arthur Montenegro's life. The penthouse, once a symbol of power and isolation, felt large and empty without the constant buzz of assistants and meetings. The silence, however, was no longer oppressive. It was filled with Leo's laughter and, with increasing frequency, Lyra's. The loss of his financial empire, which Arthur had feared like death itself, turned out to be a liberation. Stripped of the title of billionaire, he was just Arthur. And for the first time in many years, that was enough. The second victory, the most important one, occurred not in a boardroom, but on the living room rug. Leo, building one of his block castles, looked up at Arthur, who now spent his afternoons with him, and said something that redefined the concept of wealth for his father. "Dad, are you not going to those boring meetings anymore?" "No, champ, not anymore." Leo smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that Arthur hadn't seen in years. "Good. Now you have more time to play." In that moment, Arthur understood the lesson Helena had tried to teach him. The true inheritance wasn't in net worth, stocks, or assets. It was in time, in presence, in the bonds that money can't buy and the lack of it cannot destroy. He had finally reconnected with his son, not as a distant provider, but as a present father. They talked about school, about superheroes, about Lyra's courage. Leo now understood that his father had chosen people over profits, and that act solidified a respect and love that no fortune could have secured. The final victory was building something new from the ashes of the past. Arthur used the capital he had left to start a new business, a small consulting firm based on principles of ethics and transparency. It was a humble but honest new beginning, and he wasn't alone. He offered Clara a minority partnership in the new firm, not as an act of charity, but as recognition of her courage and an investment in her intelligence. Clara, with her quiet wisdom, became an invaluable advisor. Lyra, the unlikely heroine, now ran through the halls of the company's new, modest headquarters, doing her homework at a desk in the corner while her mother and Arthur worked. The 3 weeks that had transformed their lives had forged a new family, bound not by blood, but by bravery, loyalty, and mutual gratitude. The penthouse that had nearly witnessed a tragedy became a home, the stage for dinners where laughter echoed louder than any stock market ticker. 3 weeks after that fateful morning, Arthur watched from the window of his new office, much smaller than his last, but with a clearer view. He saw Leo and Lyra playing in the small park across the street. He saw his son, who had been used as a pawn in a deception, now protecting his friend in real life, teaching her how to swing higher. He had learned the difference between being used and being a protector, discovering that heroes sometimes have to break the rules to save the ones they love. Arthur, the businessman who almost lost everything to greed, discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or Bitcoin, but in the courage of a child willing to risk everything for a forgotten act of kindness. And Lyra, the girl who faked an emergency to avert a tragedy, became the guardian angel who taught him that sometimes small lies are necessary to protect great truths. She didn't just save his life, she saved his soul, showing him that the true return on an investment is measured by the impact it has on the human heart.